Hello everyone, welcome back to another lecture on the course Python Fundamentals, Building Blocks for Aspiring Developers. So we will continue with the first module in this lecture as well, Introduction to Python. So from the agenda, we previously discussed some things on the day 1. Right now we are on the day 2. Here we will discuss some basic syntax and data types in Python and how to assign values to different variables, and we'll also try and understand what variables are. So let's start basic syntax and data types. So basic syntax. So in the previous video, as we discussed, that Python has a easier to read syntax. On the right side is just a code snippet, and it does not look too much to the eyes. I mean, it seems pretty simple. You won't understand what the code is right now, not exactly, but from the first look, you can see that it is pretty simple. So and it is much simpler because there are way lesser rules in Python to follow as compared to other programming languages. So the most important thing is Python is the indentation. It is the most important thing is in the syntax. So what is indentation? So indentation is the number of spaces. So whenever in Python we have to separate a code block or a code line from another code block, then we have to put indentations. For example, you can see the orange line just before the print statement. So that is an indentation. So this basically means that the print statement is part of the if, like the code where the line reads if x equals to 4, then print hello world. This is one piece of code, and then we have another line that says print. So print is not part of that code. It will be executed other than that if statement. This will be much more clear when we move on to these conditionals, but for now it's important to understand that we have to be careful of indentation. Similarly, I cannot just put a space before the statement. And for statement is just one line of code. Like x is equals to 4 is a statement. Print by is a statement. So if we come back to indentation, you have to understand that there are fixed indentation rules in Python. Okay, the indentation consists of 4 spaces or a tab. We can use either one of them. Either we can do 4 spaces or we can do one tab. Tab automatically moves it 4 spaces. If we do 3 spaces, then it will show an error. Similarly, if we do 6 spaces or 7 spaces, it will show an error. So this is why we have to be careful of the indentation. Then there are some other smaller things like colon, brackets, these sort of things. This will be much more clear as we start coding. And then there are comments. So at the top, you can see that it says this is a comment and it starts with a hashtag. So comments are basically there to describe your code. Like if you have written some code, you simply add a comment to describe what the code is doing. So for example, you have a very complex algorithm, or you're doing, let's say, solving an equation. So at the top, you just write in the comment that, okay, this piece of code is trying to solve this equation like this. So whoever reads the code, they can read the comment and understand what the next bit of code will do. So that will make it easier for them. Not for other people, it will also make it easier for you. For example, if you write some code and you come back to the code maybe after 6 months, then trying to go over the code, read each line separately, that will take a lot of time. But once you see the comments in between, you will quickly recall that what you were trying to do, and that will make it much more easier for you. So what essentially a comment does is that it does not read it as a part of code. So the line that says this is a comment, it will not be executed. You can just simply think of it like it will be skipped during the execution of code. So it doesn't matter what we write in the comment. It doesn't matter about the spaces we put and things like that. It will simply be skipped when the code is being executed. And so we can also take advantage of this in another way. For example, when we are writing a code and we do not want to execute one line in the code, I mean, it's a code, but we do not want to execute this line maybe during debugging. So we just add a hashtag at the start of the line. So what it does that it converts this piece of line into a comment. So now it is a comment, it will be skipped. So I did not have to remove that line of code, and I can test the code, and afterwards if I still need that line of code I can just simply remove the hashtag and it will be a part of code again. So this is how we use comments in Python. We will also do everything that we're talking about in practical, so everything will be much more clear to you. So let's move on. So data types. So data types are the types of data that we store in Python. So there are essentially four data types: integer, float, string, and boolean. So let's go over each of them. So integer is represented as int, like we say int in Python when we refer to an integer. It's just a short form. So these are basically whole numbers. They can be positive, they can be negative. For example, you can see the numbers listed: 4, 10, 250, -14. So these are all examples of integer data types. Then we have float data types, and these are decimal numbers. Just in mathematics you have decimal numbers, we call them float in Python, and these are nothing different than decimal numbers. Again, these can be positive and negative, as you can see from the examples: 24.9, 22.1, -58.3, and also 89.0. Now 89.0 is a float because we have added a decimal there. Even though it is not 89.1 or 89.2, still it is a float data type. Even though we can write it as an integer because 89 is a whole number, but since we have added 89.0, it will be considered a float or a decimal number. Next we have string. So characters or alphabets are called as strings. For example, you write some word in Python, let's say you say Python. So that is basically a string in Python. It is like lots of characters. Like for example, if you write Python, the characters are P, Y, T, H, O, N. So there are 6 characters in the word Python. So the word Python as a whole is a string, and each of the 6 alphabets are characters. Okay. Now characters can also be numbers. It is not limited to only alphabets. It can also be numbers. We will see that in examples. So here are 4 examples of strings. So the first string is hello, simply alphabets. Then there's a string called Python. Then there's a string called I love Python. So this means your complete sentences can even be strings. One thing you must notice that whenever we write strings, we have to put that string within quotes. It can be single quotes or it can be double quotes. It doesn't matter. You can choose either one of them, but it's recommended that you only use one type throughout the code. For let's say if you're using single quotes for strings, you must use single quotes throughout the code for strings. If you're using double quotes, you must use double quotes throughout the code. It doesn't matter. It's not that one is better than the other one. They're all the same. It's just a personal preference which one to use. Now, why we say that you only have to use one? There will be no error if you use both of them. But it is easier for the person to read the code if you have just used one notation. You also must note that you have to use the same starting and ending quote. If it's a single quote, the starting and ending both will be single quotes. If it's a double quote, starting and ending both must be double quotes. It cannot be that you put single quote at the start of the string and a double quote at the end of the string. That will simply be an error. Now the last example that you can see is 43 number within single quotes. So whenever we put something within single quotes, that automatically becomes a string, even if it is a number, even if it is an integer. So this 43 will now be considered as a string. So what this means is that I cannot add it to another number. Like I have this string 43 and I try to add it to number 4. It will show an error because both of them are different data types. It will just say that you're trying to add an alphabet or a string to a number, which is not possible. So it depends on the use case where we want to keep a number as a string. Okay. And the final data type is boolean or bool as we call it. So these hold basically true, two values only, true or false. So these values are special values, you can say, and these can only be true or false, and it helps us in the code when we are writing the code to create algorithms. So we will also go over these in the practical. So let's move on and see what are variables. So variables are basically used to store data. Um, let's say if you look at this code over here on the right side, which says number is equals to 4, and then it says name is equals to John. So from this you must simply understand that number is a integer type. It has a data like 4 is integer. Then the name John is what? It should be a string because we have written it in single quotes. And the last variable number 2 is 4.3. That means that it is a floating number. Yeah. So the word number here, that is a variable. Okay, and we assigned it a value of 4. Now wherever I write this word number, it will automatically say the number is 4. Similarly for the name John, like the name of the variable is name and it holds the value of John. So you can think of it like this figure at the bottom. So you can think of it like a container or a box. Okay, so the first one is a box. Okay, so that is just an empty box, and in the second step we say, okay, the name of the variable is a, so the box has a name a. Okay, so you say that this box is the box a. Okay, you mark it as a, and the third step we put a value of 10 in this one. So we put a value of 10 inside the box. So the label of the box is the name of the variable. In this case it will be a, and the value inside the box is the value that the variable holds, so that is 10. So this means that the variable a has a value of 10. So wherever in the code we will use the value a, we will use the variable a, that will automatically have a value of 10. Okay. Now the thing to note here is that the variable names are case sensitive. Like in the example you can see on the right side, name is not equals to name with a capital N, and it is not equals to name with all capital letters. In Python it is very important that the case is the same, like uppercase or lowercase, it is the same. If you just change the case of even one letter in the variable name, the Python cannot then identify it. Okay, and the variables, the name of the variable can have numbers, letters or underscores. Not, I mean, other than any of these three, it cannot have anything else. Okay, so these are the rules for variable names. So a variable name must start with a number or a underscore. It actually must not start with a number but with a underscore. So for example, you will see the examples. Let's just first read out the rules and just apply to the examples. The second one is that it cannot start with a number but can contain a number in between or the end. So the number cannot be at the start but can be at the end or in between. It can only contain numbers, letters or underscores as we discussed, and we do not need to specify the data type. Like in this one, all of these are integers, but we do not need to specifically tell Python that, okay, this variable holds the data of type integer. Now if we go over the examples, the first one is a valid variable name. It follows all the rules. It has an alphabet, no number, that's fine. Second is also valid because it starts with an underscore, that is valid for Python. Third is not valid because it starts with a dollar sign. Now the rule is that it must start with an alphabet or a underscore. Any character other than that is invalid. Similarly, for the fourth one, num dollar, again, we cannot put dollar in our variable name. Then number underscore new is a valid because underscore is in between, and we can use the underscore anywhere, start, between, or at the end. Then the number with a capital B is also valid because it is following the rules. Even if B is capital, it is still following the rules. The one underneath this one, num space bur, that is invalid because we cannot have a space in a variable name. Then the variable name for number is also invalid because a variable name cannot start with a number. The two at the bottom are both correct. They have a number at the end, not at the start, or they have a number in between. And the variable names can also be a combination of alphabets, numbers, and underscores, but at the correct positions. So this is how we assign values to a variable. We just say equal to. So we say name equal to John. This means that the variable name has a value of John. Then we have the second one. We assign a value of 21, which is an integer, to a variable called age. Then in the third one, we assign a value of 8.4 to a variable called score. And the fourth one is a boolean. So this is how you define a boolean variable. So is student is underscore student is the name of the variable, and it holds a value of true. So this means that the fourth variable is of type boolean or bool. Um, in Python, we can also then reassign the values to the variables. For example, in the second image, you can see that the first four are the same, but at the end, I'm doing age is equals to 23. The name of the variable is same, age, but I'm giving it a value of 23 now. So the value is overwritten in the variable. So now whenever I use the variable called age, the value will be 23 instead of 21. Okay. And we can also even change the data types. But it also depends on what data type are we changing. For example, if we have character, let's say A, and we convert it into an integer, that is not possible because how would you convert an alphabet to an integer? But in the example, as you can see, we have a age is equals to 21, but the age is not an integer. You can see from the single quotes that it is a string. So how I convert it into an integer? I simply write int, and in the brackets I write the same variable name, that is age. So now the same variable age is overwritten, like the value that is stored in age is now 21, but it is of type integer. Okay, so this is how we can play around with variables. And finally, for this lecture, we have the print statement. So print statement, we just wrote a print statement in the previous lecture when we created our first code. So print is used to print something on screen. You write print, and within the parentheses, you have to write whatever you want to print. Now, obviously, if you are writing a string, it has to be in single quotes. You can also use the name of variable in the print. So in the second picture, you can see that name is equals to John, and I say print name. So what it will print? It will print John. It will print the value that is within the variable. So you see how variable names are used in the code. This is just one example, but let's say you want to use the same name like in 10 different places. So you will not write the name at 10 different places. In the start, you will say name is equals to John, and in those 10 places, you will simply use the variable name, and then it will automatically point you to the value John. We can also print two different data types or more than two data types in print statement, but they have to be separated by a comma. So you can see we have a variable called age has a value of 21, and in the print statement what we are doing is that we are saying hi, my age is 21. So hi, my age is, this is a string, and then we also have to put in an integer. You see 21 is an integer, so if we have to put them in the same print statement, we have to separate them by a comma, and it will appear on the screen. So this is just the part of part of the syntax of Python. We cannot change this. Okay. And now let's start coding. So first, what you want to do is you want to open up VS Code as we did last time. So let's go ahead here. So this is VS Code that I have opened. So this is the same file that we used last time. We printed this hello world, but I will just remove this one for now and start with today's lecture. So let's see practically whatever we learned in today's lecture. So let's start with the comments first. So let's say this is how I add a comment. This is a comment. So this will not be executed. And if I say print and I say hello world and I save the file, you need to save the file. You can press Ctrl S to save it, or you can go there and save it. It doesn't matter. You can do right click and run Python, or you can even go here and run without debugging, and it should show here hello world. So you see this comment had no effect on whatever we were doing. Let's say you want us to do this, x is equals to, like, x is not equal to 4, or I could say I am printing my first output. I can even write a comment after this and say code is ended, save the file and run without debugging. And you see here there is no change in the output because it is not considered as a piece of code. It is simply skipped during code. Okay, so now let's look at some of the spaces. So if I add one space here and do a save, now you see there is a red underline. Now this underline is due to VS Code because it tries to show you errors in your code right away. But let's just say I added one space and I was to run the code. So let's see, it gives us an error, indentation error. So in Python, you either have to have 0 spaces or a tab 4 spaces. Now tab is also important. Like, I cannot just put 4 spaces here. We can only put 4 spaces wherever we have to do this. Let's say if true. You do not need to worry about the if statement. We will go over this later, but I'm just writing it so you can understand the indentation. Let's say print hello Python. So this seems good. So as you can see, I have here a tab. I can do 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces, or I can do a tab. It is the same thing. And if I save the code, then Control F5 will also run the code from me. So it says hello world and hello Python. Now if I add some, like if I want something after the if, I do not want it to be part of this statement. Okay, I will have to then write it here, print code finished and save, then Control and F5 to run the code. So you see it is running, but this part here is not a part of this if statement. Okay, this is how indentation works in Python. Okay, so this is just to give you an idea. It will be much more clear when we move over to these conditionals and loops that make use of these spaces. So that will be much more clear to you. So now what we want to do is that we want to understand the print statement first a bit more. So it is, so you can follow it when we move to the variables. So let's say print hello world. We've already seen this. Now I also want to print a number. So let's say the number is 10. And I do this and I do control and F5 to run the code. So it says hello world 10. Now if I remove this here, it will automatically show an error to me, like it says syntax error. Why are you putting this number in between? It doesn't understand. So if I have two different data types, one is string and one is a number, I have to put this comma in between. I can even do this. Put another comma and again start another line. Hello world. Let's say how are you? Save it, then run the code, and now it's fine. Hello world 10, how are you? So whenever we are using more than one variable type, one data type here in print, we have to just separate it by a comma. So this is how print statement works, and you can see whatever we write in here simply appears here on the terminal on our output. So now let's see different variables. So let's say I have a variable called number and it holds a value of 1. So this is how you define a variable that holds a value of 1, which is an integer. Now how is it different? For example, in some languages we have to do int number is equals to 1 like this. This is just a part of their syntax. For example, in C language or C++, you have to say, okay, this variable will hold the data type integer only. It cannot hold the data type of string or float. For example, if I were to do this in C++, it would be correct. But if I were to do this, 10.3, it will show me an error. It will say, okay, you say that the variable will only hold integer, but you are assigning it a value of float. That is not correct. That is an error. But in Python, we do not have to deal with it because we do not have to specify the data type here. We do not have to write integer or string or float. We do not have to write it. When we assign the value here, it automatically sees that, okay, this is an integer, so this variable is of type integer. Similarly, if I were to say name is equals to John, now this variable is of type string because it sees the value is string and it will just say, okay, it is a string. Now similarly, let's say score is equals to 9.2. So this is of type float. So this is how we define different variables. One thing we must look at is the difference of single quotes and double quotes. So let's say I have another variable called, let's call it surname, and let's call this one first name, and John, let's say this. So I can also do this. I can also use these double quotes and that will be fine. I can also even print it. Let's say I want to print first name and then I want to print surname. Okay. So again, these are two different variables, so I have to separate them by a comma. Even though these are the same data types, both of them are string, but they are different variables. I have to separate them by a comma. So I will save the file and I will run it. So it says John Doe. Now it doesn't matter if I use double quotes or I use single quotes, won't be an issue. If I remove this part here, save the code, run the code again, it simply prints John. Now the error will be if I change this here, and let's just change this to this. I'm starting with a single quote, ending with a double quote, save the file, execute the code. It says, okay, what are you doing? There is a syntax error. So we either have to use single quotes or double quotes, but it is fine either way if you use one of them. It is not that one is better than the other one. Now also let's have a look at the case, like how is it case sensitive. For example, I change it to this surname. I only changed the N to a capital N from here. So let's say run the code. What does it say? It says name error. This variable surname is not defined. It says, okay, there is no variable called surname. There is a variable called surname, but it is not the same exact case as this one because n is a uppercase. So it simply says, okay, what is surname? You have not defined it. So we need to be careful of this. Okay. Now we can also try out some other things. For example, I say 6 number equals to 21 and it should give us an error. So it says, okay, syntax error. This is an invalid syntax because a variable name cannot start with a number, yeah. So I can also start with a underscore. Now okay, let's just print it out too and run the code. It prints 21. There is no problem starting it with this one. Okay. We can also not start it with like this. Again, an error. And I can also not do this. Again, an error. Now you're seeing this as red and it is already underlined. This is a feature of VS Code, Visual Studio Code, not a feature of Python in itself. Because Visual Studio Code makes it easier for you. Like if you're typing in your variable name and you accidentally press this, it will simply highlight it so you will know, okay, you have made an error, you will simply correct it. Okay. So this is, you see how we have to follow the names of the naming convention. Now there are some other things, some other rules which are not technically incorrect, but we should not use them as variable names. For example, I should not do print is equals to 7 because print is in itself a keyword in Python. Like print I'm using here, I should not do this. See? Oops, that is a problem for this one. You see, it has now changed it. So I cannot use this anymore because I have assigned a value to this called print. Similarly, there are a lot of keywords. For example, I cannot use the word if, I cannot use the word else, I cannot use the word bool, I cannot use the word int, I cannot use the word string, str, I cannot use the word continue. So there's a list of these words. You can simply go on internet and find out which words not to use. So there's a list of them and you shouldn't use them. Now one tip that I have for you regarding variable names is to make them descriptive. Like whatever value you are holding in the variable, your variable name should tell you that. For example, if I remove everything like this and remove this here and I just say x is equals to John and I print here x. So we know that, okay, this is the first name and we say y is equals to do. Now these both are correct variable names. Nothing wrong with that. Even if I run the code, I have this output here, this according to this, but it is not a good practice. Why? Because we want the variable names to be descriptive. So if we read the variable name, we should know what value we stored in the variable. Like after, let's say, 6 months, you come to this code, there are maybe 100 more lines of code and you see, okay, x, you say, okay, what is the value of x? You have to search for that in code. But if you say first name and you say last name, and let's just copy this one, paste this one over here like this, and I run it now, it will, oops, this is an error like this. So now whenever I see this first name, I will understand, okay, this variable has the first name according to the data that I have in the code. So it is very important to have this, make the variable names descriptive. Also, you shouldn't have too long variable names, like you say first name of my friend in school. So this is a very long variable name. It is not easy on the eye. So you should not use this. Or you can make it short. you can do this fname and you can say school. So I mean it is not as descriptive, but still it is a shorter name and it is easier to read. Now you must have noticed one thing is that I am using a lot of underscores in the naming. Why is that? When we have a variable name that is more than one or two words, we try to separate the words using underscore so it is easier to read. I could also write it like this: first name, last name, but it is not that easier to read. If I add an underscore in between, now it is much more easier for me to read. So these are just some good practices that you must follow. Now let's go ahead and see how we can reassign a value to a variable. So let's say I have this variable here, first name is John, and I print first name. Let me just do like this. So it doesn't matter about how many spaces you leave in between, like how many lines you leave in between, that is not a problem, but the problem is with this, okay, with the space. And also in Python, whenever you move to the next line, it automatically means that okay, next line is started and this is the end of this line. Okay, so let's say I have this variable called first name, and here I say I want to change the first name is equals to Mary. So, and I print the first name again, and let's just print it here, new name, and let's say like this. Okay, so in the start the variable has a value of John and we print it here, and then we overwrite the value in the same variable and give it this value, and then we print it again. Now it will not show us any error, but it will overwrite the code. So in the first one we say okay, first name has a value of John and it prints John here according to this line. Then we say okay, we want to overwrite that, we want to change the name, and we give it a value of Mary. Now according to this print statement, the value in this variable first name has been updated due to this. Now it says new name is Mary. Okay, so this is how we can reassign variables. Now the last thing that we must discuss now is the use of is the changing of data types. Let me just remove everything now. Yes. So let's say I have a number and I am using it as a string. Now this is not a number, this is a string. How I would convert it into a number? I would say number is equals to int and number. Oops, I would do it like this, and now it is converted into a string. We run the code. You won't see any difference here, but how we can see the difference is that let's say I'd say print type number. So what this type does is that it simply prints the type of this data type. If it is a string, or if it is a boolean, or if it is a integer, whatever it is, it prints for us. So now let's just copy it again, paste in place of this. Now this one should print the type of this, and this print should print the type of this. Save the code, run the code. So the first it says class string. Now this is a type string, but I convert it here into an integer. Now when I print it here, it is of type integer. You see? Now if I were to break this line for you, you could also do it like this. You could say new number is equals to integer number, and here you would say new number. And so what this does is that you have a variable called number, you have a new variable called new number, you convert this into an integer and the value is stored into this variable, and then we can use this variable as it is, or we can override this variable again. But we can also skip this line here and we can simply say number here. So we are doing two things in this line. We are first converting the data type to an integer, and then we are overwriting the variable, overwriting the value in this variable. Okay, so this is how you can play around with variables, change their data types and stuff, and this is important to learn for you. So yeah, that's all for this lecture. Hopefully it was useful for you, and do keep practicing about these things. Try and play around with the naming conventions, with the syntax. You can even try to write wrong syntax and see what error you get, and that will make you much more proficient in this. And that will be all in this video, and we'll see you in the next video. Up till then, goodbye.